It was like we were the long-lost brothers and sisters of the one humanity that finally found each other. And when I would bring the people together, they would cling to each other when it was time to say goodbye. It was always difficult to say goodbye.
I'm Heather Grish, and this is the Wisdom of the Body podcast. This podcast explores the idea of body intelligence as the real key to learning the knowledge of life, or what we call Ayurveda in the ancient language of Sanskrit. We do that by connecting with today's creative leaders and experts who will help you listen to your body, trust your gut, and live in deeper harmony with nature. Come join me as we unlock the golden door to clear, direct perception and become very deep listeners. You can find the Wisdom of the Body podcast on Apple, Spotify, and Stitcher. You can also follow us by joining my email at heathergrish.com or on Instagram at heathergrish. I know you're going to love this podcast, so take a second right now to subscribe. If the world seems like it's a bit unstable and aggressive today, here's an opportunity to gain a little bit of a longer view. Pull up a comfortable seat because this is a rare interview with a very special person who has a gift for turning enemies into friends. She's been a global peace mediator for a lot of her life and is the co-founder of what later became the world's most popular yoga magazine, Yoga Journal. She is a huge part of why yoga is now so huge in the United States. She's a woman who had 5 children over the course of 3 decades, who became one of the most respected female yoga teachers in the world, way back before many women were even teaching yoga, and has done groundbreaking work as a peace mediator in the former Soviet Union and in the Middle East. While it seems like so many of us are forcing and protecting our way through life, my guest today embodies courage, receptivity, and love, and I'm thrilled to share this heartfelt interview with you. You're listening to the Wisdom of the Body. Today, I'm here with Rama Jyoti Vernon, who's an international yoga instructor, a peace mediator, and founder of the California Yoga Teachers Association, whose newsletter became Yoga Journal. She's also organized citizen diplomats for peace work in the Soviet Union during the 1980s, and she's the author of the ultimate yoga practice book, Yoga, the Practice of Myth and Sacred Geometry, and yoga philosophy commentaries, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, Gateway to Enlightenment. And I have to say, it's really quite a privilege to have you here today on this podcast. So thank you so much for joining us, Rama.
Thank you, Heather, for inviting me.
Some of my listeners who may have never met you and heard about your work before, I know that you're kind of a force that's been behind a lot of the, say, maybe yoga infrastructure that we have set up today in the United States. And they may not understand the history of a lot of how these things came to be in the United States. And so what I'd love to hear is a little bit about your journey and kind of when you were first exposed to yoga, when that was, and how that experience led to you teaching yoga. And then later, I know one of the things we're going to talk about is also the peace mediation efforts that you've done around the world. So how did that journey go for you?
You asked earlier how I started in yoga, and it was in 1955. And my mother took me to my first yoga teacher. And yoga, in those days, people confused it with yogurt. And they always would say, "Oh, what do you do?" And I said, "Well, I teach yoga." And they would say, "Oh, I love yoga. It's so good with fruit." That's how early it was in our yoga history here in the United States. So it's been a wonderful journey. And then I was asked to go, after I saw the way this yoga teacher, his presence of being, he was 84 in those days, not far from where I am now. And the way he moved his hand through air when he was teaching us pranayama, and as he moved his hand to bring the thumb and forefinger to his nostrils for alternate nostril breathing, the way his hand moved through air gave me such a feeling of peace, which I didn't have when I was 15. It was a pretty rough teen years emotionally. And the way his hand moved gave me such peace inside. I want that. I want that. Whatever he's doing, I want that. And that name was called yoga. So I began exploring in the late 1950s when I was still in high school and reading Yogananda's book and other things. There wasn't much available in those days, but I got everything I could, not knowing that, a little more than 10 years later, I would be teaching yoga. So it was a great journey. I had many different teachers at different times. You know how one thing leads to another, and then I end up in graduate school at California Institute, now called for Integral Studies. And I went 8 years to graduate school and could study Sanskrit and meditation, Vipassana, and philosophy, and all the things I really, truly craved and looked for my entire life since I was a child. And so that led to more teaching opportunities. And in those days, there were so few teachers. I seemed to know everyone in the US, but we never had to compete. We didn't compete with one another. I tried to support the teachers that were there in bringing other teachers from India into my home and having satsang gatherings for teachers throughout the greater Bay Area. And this was the days before computers. And so it was all done person to person. And it was a wonderful venture. And that's how the Yoga Journal started. I was doing a newsletter trying to bring articles and information to our members of we eventually called it California Yoga Teachers Association. And I started the newsletter that became the Yoga Journal on my dining room and kitchen table. It was very down home in those days. And then I watched it get more and more professionalized, and younger generations of people came in to help me, and then others kept carrying it forth. And it was quite a unique time in history. I didn't know how far reaching some of these organizations and the magazine Yoga Journal would become. Wonderful people came to be on the editorial board and be writers and take it forth. It was quite unique.
It's so amazing how when I first started teaching yoga, I actually had a similar thing where I watched a woman in her garden looking at a plant. And it was watching this woman look at a plant and the way that she was looking at the plant and the way that she was holding the plant.
Oh.
Yeah. And the connection, I looked and I said, I don't know what that is. I don't know what to call it, but I need that. And that later that day, I decided I need to go take a yoga teacher training. That was the idea that came up to help me find that.
Oh, when was that?
That was about 10 years ago for
My
me.
goodness. Isn't it amazing how we get that from one instant in time?
Yeah.
And it can come through others, like the love she probably had for that plant. And you could probably feel it, couldn't you?
I could. And just listening to you speak, about your history and, one of the reasons I've always been intrigued by you as a teacher is just this incredibly receptive way of being. It seems that even just listening to the way that you've talked about how you've made decisions to go down certain paths in your life, and that so much of how people operate in the world and,
Yeah.
is about, okay, I have these goals and objectives and this sort of more masculine energy, if you will.
Yeah.
And I
I
love
wasn't that way at all. I just was very still, and things would sort of come to me when I was still enough, I must say. Then things would come, or guidance would come, or it wasn't very masculine in that approach, I guess.
Yeah. And that's interesting that you bring up stillness, because just that, do you think stillness is a prerequisite for receptivity?
Well, there's a saying I once saw by a Sufi master, and he said, remain unmoving until the right action occurs. And I always found that very important, to remain unmoving. And then one of the sutras in the second chapter, there's only 3 sutras, yoga sutras, that really are directly related to the asana work that I've done for all these years. And that is Prayatnashchital Shaitilyananta Samapati Bhyan. And it says it is through relaxation of effort and meditation upon the infinite that asana is perfected. And I've always tried to practice asana in that way, the relaxation of effort, not collapsing, but relaxing my mind, relaxing my head, my tongue, my throat as I move into asana. And then it's a very different experience than if I was tensing my neck and my throat and gritting my teeth trying to get a pose. And I found that in life, that if we let go of the efforting, all things seem to come to us. Does that make sense, Heather?
Yeah, it really does. And, a lot of the listeners may not really, I think when a person does yoga, let's just say they do the yoga asanas, because that's the poses.
Yeah.
That's sort of I guess, the manifested form that everybody's familiar with. And that everyone gets a sense that there's something that they learn and something that they realize about themselves or their bodies or the way they're holding their energy, their will, their effort, and things like that in the process of it. And maybe a lot of people don't know that there's this whole study that is available
Right.
for people to
Yeah.
learn about, in addition to just the poses.
Yeah. Well, asana for me became my central focus. And then I brought the philosophy into it. And when I write about the Yoga Sutras, or what I wrote in my book on sacred geometry, it was all about the asana was central to everything. And then how we can see it operating in our everyday life. What we learn through asana, we can take into our everyday life. And I've never really separated much, but I've always tried to bring it into the awareness of the postures, because I've always said the way we do the pose is the way we do our lives.
Mm.
And you can see it reflected. You can tell when a person, as a teacher for all these 50 something years, you can see so much on a body when they start to move. And you can see a lot that relates to that person's life. Just as when we are practicing the pose, we practice it in such a way that we bring those much needed changes, perhaps, into our everyday life. So it's hard for me to separate life from asana.
Yeah.
And even the term asana, people don't quite know how to define it. And as my Sanskrit teacher one day said, he said the term us means to be or to breathe. And he would take this back, break out the verbs. And he said, and san is from sam, meaning to become one with, put it together with. And na is the eternal cosmic vibration. So asana is really defined more accurately as to be or to breathe and become one with the eternal cosmic vibration.
Oh, wow. I think we should just stop it right there.
Yeah, that's it.
Right. That's so beautiful. And to learn this at such a young age, and it sounds like you started at 15 getting into this and been studying, and I'm sure you still studied from what I know about you. And you've just published several books in the last few years.
Yeah.
So obviously, in order to produce books, we're always still learning.
Well, I guess I've been pretty lazy. And I wasn't planning to do any writing. And then just one day, Desikacharya in India, I went there to study with him on some of the philosophy. And I always admired him as a teacher. He was the son of Krishnamacharya. And Mr. Iyengar, who I sort of brought him to the West Coast and went to meet him in 70 to find him in India. No one knew anything about him then, or very few did. And I went to ask him to come here. And so I would interact with Desikacharya over the years. And he said he always marveled at the fact that I was out there teaching and teaching teachers and starting training programs and organizations to help them. And he said his father had to take him kicking and screaming into the yoga. He wanted to be an engineer. And he was the one that said to me, if you don't leave the legacy for the teachers to come and write down what you have learned through yoga over these many years, he said, you are what the Bhagavad Gita would call the thief in the night, meaning one who takes in knowledge, but doesn't give it out enough. And so his words kept me going to do this writing. I'm still not done yet. I have several books ahead.
Well, that's good. And I've read Yoga, the Practice of Myth and Sacred Geometry. And one of the things that I recall from that book is the page about the breath. And when we go through the gunas, or sort of the journey from rajas to tamas, and some of the listeners may not actually even know what I'm talking about. So I might need to have you explain that in a more layperson's term. But just the way that the breath changes when the qualities of our mind change as well.
Yes, you can see the breath. You can see where the person is mentally, emotionally through their breath. And you're talking about the three gunas,
Yes.
the constituents of nature. And the first one is very dull and apathetic and immobility of energy. And you can see that when the breath is held a lot, when the breath is just not rhythmic, it's not visible very much. And then the rajas, rajas comes from raga, which means rage in Sanskrit, but it's more like the mood of raga. Like in Indian music, you have the morning raga, the afternoon raga, the midnight raga. These are songs that depict the time of day. And that's where the breath gets very rapid above the diaphragm. And one is really efforting, trying to make something happen. And that can be seen on their breath, which is just a little bit above the diaphragm. When they're agitated, when they're upset over something. And then you have the sattvic, which is the serenity, equanimity, when the mind is more calm. And the whole Bhagavad Gita speaks to that calmness of mind in action, the inaction within the action. And this is the serenity, equanimity of mind. It's the calmness of mind. And the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna recommends that to Arjuna, who represents us, the individual soul, that we try to bring that into everything we're doing in life. And that can be seen in a very calm, stable, steady way of the mind interacting in life, the postures of life. So that's what you were speaking of in the three gunas, I assume?
Yes. And I find it interesting that you're talking about that in terms of, hadn't made that connection with the rage of
With
rajas
Raja.
before.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't made that. And I know that you've done I mean, it sounds like you've been studying Sanskrit for a very long time, and I've only been studying it for a short period of time compared to you. And I know that you were active, you've done throughout the years, various ways. You've been a peace mediation, I guess, activist. And
Yeah.
listening to hear you speak about the gunas and the qualities of our mind, and especially in our culture right now, maybe globally, so many people dealing with rage,
Yeah.
dealing with that So what are some of the tools that you think are available through yoga to make an impact in the world through peace?
Well, I found when people would call me and with real things that were going on in their life, like one woman called and she was going to have dinner with her boss. And she was so angry at her boss for not giving her a raise or a promotion. And she had so much rage inside of her. She was afraid to be with her boss for fear she would just yell at the boss. And so she called and she said, "What can I do?" I said, "Do half hour of forward bends." And that activates, the forward bends activate the posterior nerves and the parasympathetic nervous system, which dilates and opens, where the sympathetic, which we stimulated in back bends, is that brings up more constriction in the blood vessels. So if a person's very lethargic and they do the back bends, they will become more active and it can balance them. But I said to her, don't do any back bends at all, just forward bends. And that will dilate, that will help you in that way. And she did that. And she went to the dinner. And when she got there, she couldn't remember what she was angry about. And it's a good thing because the boss brought her to dinner because she wanted to give her a promotion and a raise. And she could have blown it.
Wow.
So this is where, if we know how to practice the asana, in what way and for what, it can help us throughout life, and she was so thankful for not being reactive when she first arrived. She could have lost everything, including her job.
Wow. And this is really useful in our personal lives. It's really useful for us in our work lives,
Yeah.
probably also our relationships. And then with sort of the larger fear of what happens in the world and the things that occur in the world that frustrate us. You in the 80s were involved with some peace mediation efforts in the Soviet Union. Is that correct?
Yes. I was invited on a trip with a peace group, and I had never believed that peace was exterior. I believed how Swami Vivekananda always said that world peace was like the kink of a dog's tail. As long as you are holding it, you think it's straight, but the moment you let go, it just kinks up again. And so I believe that. I felt the best thing, the gift I could give to the world was my own inner peace through my meditations and my practice. So I just did that for 30 years. And then I was invited to the Soviet Union. And I thought, oh, that should be fun, going behind the Iron Curtain and seeing the, quote, enemy.
We're getting into the time of year for giving. Fall is Vata season, and it's a time of letting go and moving things around. Do you have a cause that you love to donate to? I actually think that giving is so important for our health. In fact, the word for heart in Sanskrit, hridaya, is made up of 3 characters, and together, these 3 characters signify an organ that receives, gives, and just keeps doing it over and over and over again. So if you have something to give, then give to something that pulls on your heartstrings, and you will see the magic that happens inside you. Yeah, actually, for the listeners who are younger than us, that don't know what life was like then, why was that such a big deal to be doing what you were doing?
Well, the reason I accepted to do that was because of my children. They would come home from school and say, why should we bother? We're just going to blow up. The Soviets are going to invade us, because the movies and things were talking about it. And there was a movement in our government to keep the distance with the Soviet Union. They were the, quote, enemy, and we needed it. I didn't know at the time, for our nuclear arms buildup. And, I believe that the Soviets were our enemy. I drank the Kool-Aid. I believed the whole story we were given. So when I went, and I did it for my children because they were living in fear. They were having nuclear bomb drills in the schools in those days, in the early 80s. And all of our connection with the Soviet Union was cut off, all of it. No educational exchanges, no sports exchanges. It was pretty distant. And when I went over there, my first day in Red Square, I came face to face with my own fears that I remember just trembling when I saw the red star on the Kremlin and the boots with the red star of the soldiers and the red star bands. And I watched the soldiers marching near Lenin's tomb with the goose steps that I associated with Hitler's Germany. And so it was pretty frightening, but I also realized that I was raised in a metaphysical home, not a political home. But I knew that if enough of us had that fear, we would draw to us the thing we feared most. And at that time, I realized the collective fear was greater than what was happening. Russia, or Soviet Union in those days, looked like it was a post-World War II movie. The trucks were like from the 40s or maybe the 50s now and then. The whole place was gray. There were long lines of people to get any kind of food, and fruit was not usually available. If there was a carton of oranges, people would line up for blocks to get an orange. And it was very solemn. People were still living in the fear of Stalin's Russia. And it had moved on beyond that. We had gone just beyond the Brezhnev era. And it was just before the Gorbachev era. I was there when Chernenko and Andropov were the prime ministers. And Gorbachev hadn't come into the office yet. So it was a very bleak place and very behind the times. And I thought, and everywhere I went to see, I had to see into the eyes of the enemy. I wanted to see it. And there I found only the face of the friend. It was amazing. They not only looked like us, bone structure, a mixture of many different cultures, but it was their children would laugh in the park I was in. And that child sounded like my child. And then a child fell down and started crying. And the cries of that child were just like the cries of my child. And then one day I went to the marketplace. It's very early in the morning, around 6:30. And it was a very elder generation, babushka, which means grandmother. She came running up to me and I towered over her. And she said, Italiano, asking me if I was Italian. And I said, no, Amerikansky. And she immediately threw up her arms, fell on her knees, and started crying, begging me for peace. And I realized in that moment that I may be the only American she ever met or associated with. And in that moment, I was like an ambassador for our country in the way I would interact with her. And I lifted her up and held her. And we both cried. And as I held her, I bent way down and I put my cheek next to hers. And this is the days before the COVID. And our tears mingled. And I just realized these people were not our enemy. And so I came back to tell the world and my constituents that they were not the enemy. And it was like people were hungry to hear this. But nowadays it's a little different because we don't have Gorbachev in office. I met Gorbachev in the Kremlin. He was wonderful, wonderful man, as far as I was concerned. And then I later met Putin without knowing who he was. No one knew that he would be a future leader. And he was a very different person than Gorbachev. He brought back what many people seemed to want in those days, and that was the dictatorship. And a lot of people that I intermingled with I ended up being there quite a while. And people kept saying to me they wanted to go back to a dictatorship. Well, anyway, They wanted to do that because they had the fear of the unknown.
Mm.
And in yoga, Heather, our whole thing of taking variations on each of the 84 basic poses, there's 100,000 variations, because each time we go to a new variation of the asana, we face a new fear. We face a new fear, perhaps it's going to hurt. We face a fear of moving into the unknown. When we were in a headstand and we would drop backwards, that would frighten people more than dropping forward, because the back body represents the unknown, that which we cannot see. And so they wanted to return to the way life was, because they were fearful of where Gorbachev was taking them.
Mm.
So it was a very interesting time. And I brought a few thousand Americans over there and brought 100 top-level Soviets over here to this country and sent them all over the country. And many, many adventures during that time, trying to find new loopholes, new ways we could open the doors for our people to intermingle and associate with one another.
Mm.
It was like we were the long-lost brothers and sisters of the one humanity that finally found each other. And when I would bring the people together, they would cling to each other when it was time to say goodbye. It was always difficult to say goodbye.
Mm.
So that's why I started doing that work, which led to work in the Middle East. We put on a yoga conference in Costa Rica called Uniting the Americas Through Yoga. We put on a peace conference in Jerusalem, and that was for peace in the Middle East. And then finally, I was able to put on a conference in Russia with the sponsorship of the Ministry of Health of the government.
Mm.
And it changed. Then all of a sudden, the doors flung open wide for yoga then. And in those days, when I first went in 1983, it wasn't open to yoga. Yoga was too individualistic and could create more individualism in people, which wasn't desired at that time. So it was a long journey. And I thought, well, maybe Swami Vivekananda was wrong. Maybe the kink of the dog's tail could stay. But after bringing thousands of people there and doing many, many conferences there and around the world, I discovered that things did go back. In Russia, I was, back to the dictatorship. And so I felt in 1990, came back to the United States to just teach yoga again.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
With a very new dimensional outlook.
Mm. And I was a young girl during that time when you were there, and I have really vivid memories of that time and the fear. I was probably like your children.
Yes.
Because I was born in 1977.
Yes.
So I remember what life was like as a child during that time. And, I actually would laugh, or I don't know what to feel about this now, but I remember my dad bought me a shirt that it was like a US military kind of shirt, and it said, "Kill a commie for mommy."
And what did it say?
It said, "Kill a commie for mommy."
Oh, God.
And I was like 7 years old
Oh,
walking
my
around.
gosh. Oh, my gosh. You know that I only met almost about, 8 years. I was working back and forth. I was flying there every month, sometimes twice a month, because we didn't have email. We didn't have really many computers. And we took the first fax machine in over there. We took the first computers, 1983 computers over there, and to equip our office. And all the times and all the officials that I met during the years from every official agency, all the private people, we took people in to meet. I only met one communist who believed in communism, one person out of the thousands I intermingled with. And I would laughingly joke and say, I think there were more communists in this country than there were over there, because they had to live under it. We didn't. Oh my gosh, it was not pleasant at all. But we tried to keep opening new pathways for the people over there at the time.
So would you say that from a young age, I mean, it sounds like as a young woman in your teens that you were seeking peace
I was
yourself.
seeking inner peace, yeah.
Mm.
But I really didn't believe outer peace was possible. And then one of my last trips, just before the tanks came in with Boris Yeltsin jumping on top of it, which was a real photo op for him, I remember that I wasn't interested in anything political, nothing. But I was raised in a metaphysical home, a metaphysical environment, which made me understand that if we went on thinking they were our enemies, we would create that very scenario. And how powerful the mind is. And as the Dalai Lama said, the mind is more powerful than bombs. And so I just said, okay, I'll give my 1 year of my life to, quote, outer peace. So I ended up working with the Soviet Union for about 8 years. What I learned, oh my gosh, I learned so much through that. I learned that there's no separation between inner and outer peace. And I began to find that I was learning so much about myself, about yoga, just by interacting with the Soviets. And that how could I separate sitting in my meditation closet in the darkness from going out there and being with, quote, the Soviets in those days.
Mm.
So it was very different. So,
And I'm just picturing you with this woman and that emotional exchange that the
yeah,
two of you had. And it just feels that, because you've been teaching yoga since then, and I know most of the people, when I've studied with you, most of the people, and this is kind of the thing with yoga in the US, is most of it's women showing up. And it's,
yeah,
there are some men, but it's more women
yeah,
that are really connecting with this practice, at
yeah.
least in the United States, which is not necessarily how it is in India.
Yes, yes. Well, in India, when I first went there in 1970, women didn't practice yoga. They thought I was very unusual that I was practicing yoga. So I was asked to teach some women in classes with their saris on, and they would giggle and laugh. And then that's the trip where I found Mr. Iyengar, who had just written a year or two before Light on Yoga.
Mm.
And when I saw that book, I had to meet this person because I always believed the philosophy and asana couldn't be separated. And the way he wrote about it, he did not separate the philosophy, the psychology from asana. And I just had to go find him and bring him to the West Coast. So it was a miracle how we ever found him. But I did, and I did bring him. And so several visits, he would stay in my home, and I would sponsor workshops for him. And the groups kept growing and growing and growing. But I was also asked to teach for Indira Gandhi's cabinet ministers at that time.
Mm.
And it was very unusual for them to see a woman demonstrating yoga. Yeah, I thought all of India would be practicing yoga, but there were more in the United States at that time that did the actual practices. And the other things that we have in yoga, the ceremonies, the chanting, other things, were just done ceremoniously as part of their religion and their beliefs that they had inherited for thousands of years. But women did not actually do the practices.
Mm.
But now, Heather, they are. Isn't that incredible?
Yeah.
And Sri Aurobindo Ghosh once said that one day the West would learn from the East, and then it would turn around where the East would be learning from the West. And when I see great teachers like David Frawley and others going over to India to teach Ayurveda or to teach yoga, I just marvel because it wasn't always that way. We learned from them to begin with.
Wow. It's really a story about crossing cultures. And it's interesting how things change when they cross a culture. And, I always think about when you have a membrane in a body and a fluid moves across that membrane, that it changes somehow
Yeah.
on the other side of it.
Yes. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's no different from the planet, is it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And we changed a lot when we were doing the work with the Soviets, because we brought them here. I connected them to their cosmonauts, to our astronauts, and their people in the Politburo with our Senate in Washington, D.C. And I was a matchmaker, bringing together the counterparts across the world with the people in this country.
It's such a beautiful role to be in. And just this word receptivity keeps coming up for me. It's definitely a big theme of this podcast and my own personal work. And to hear you speak about the ways that being still and waiting for the right moments to act,
Yeah.
being such a huge part of your life and your practice and the things that you've been able to accomplish peacefully and beautifully. And I know you're a mom.
Yes. With 5 kids and 12 grandchildren and 1 great grandchild.
Yeah. And so just the cultivation of that, part of me wonders that moment with you and that woman in Russia, would that have been possible if she were a man or if you were a man?
Yes. Well, I'll tell you, in those days, I had to work with mostly men because those were the officials. But I did work with the women's organization, and I worked with practically every agency in the Soviet Union. I could get in any door after a while, and they even gave me an office in downtown Moscow on Prospect Mira, which it means peace, the
Mm.
Avenue of Peace.
Which is
And
your daughter's name, isn't that?
my youngest daughter was almost born there, and I named her Mira for that, for the peace. It means peace, and it means the world in Russian.
Mm.
And then I later realized there was also Mirabai, who was the great illustrious Hindu saint, who was just madly in love with God and would dance and leave her kingdom and everything behind with her bhakti, her devotion for God. And I forgot when I named her because I was so immersed in the middle of Moscow at that time. And she came out when she was born at home. I had my children at home. And she was just like a little sleeping dormouse. And she was the total embodiment of peace, when she was born and as she was growing. And I'm so glad I named her that.
Sounds so perfect.
Yeah, because at that time of my life, talk about fertility. Oh my God. I had her at 46 years old. I was really pushing the envelope, wasn't I?
Well, that's become quite common these days for women to get pregnant in their 40s.
Is it really?
Yeah, it really has. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think with women working now and wanting to establish careers is probably one of the biggest reasons
Yeah.
that we wait longer. In fact, I was turning 40 when I had my kid.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. I had my first one at 17.
Wow.
We did that in those days.
That must have been a really different experience to have a child at 17 and 46. Do you
Yeah.
have a memory of how that was different?
Yes, yes. Most of my kids were 10 years apart, so they were kind of like an only child in a way. And one day I said to a friend, I said, oh my gosh, I just feel like I've had a baby on my back. I would put them on those carriers on the back, or a baby just tugging on my skirt hems all my life. And she said, you have.
Yeah.
But
Wow.
I would just pick the babies up and go on with whatever I had to do in life.
Yeah. So, in that sense, you were a modern woman for that time. And that's the way that you were living, is how a lot of the women are living now.
Well, it was interesting because I later started a large women's organization called Women of Vision, and then we added an action. And what I discovered was that as women, we didn't have to become empowered, but only to realize that we were already empowered.
Mm.
And that was what the organization was. It had women like Louise Hay and Marianne Williamson and Barbara Marx Hubbard and women who were very well known in that era. The author of The Aquarian Conspiracy, and women who were really leaders in their field. And they had a very spiritual bent too. They were all on my advisory board and on my board, and became friends, and it was a wonderful experience. And I realized we don't have to become empowered. It's like yoga. We just have to realize the power that we already have. And I always said that with yoga, we aren't joining or unifying or yoking together the individual with the universal, the Atman to the Brahman, but we're releasing in yoga. I saw that we were really releasing the impediments that keep us from realizing that we're already one. We're already one with this universal source. And it was the same with the women's organization. And I began to see how much I learned working with the Soviet Union and then working with these incredibly powerful women. And we would put on conferences in different parts of the world. And of course, now we don't do that anymore. It's different. And I just discovered a lot. And from the Soviets, I discovered there's no difference between the inner and outer peace. And that I applied that inner peace that I found through yoga. Then I was asked to come and to mediate warring countries, warring factions. One was Armenian and Azerbaijan. And I brought the countries together in the Ukraine, in Kiev. And in one day, they wouldn't talk or look at each other. And in one day, we came to working on joint projects between their countries. I felt very equanimous during this project. And I realized something, that we have to be in that state of yoga where we hold 2 points of perspective simultaneously to make it work with warring factions. Because if we lean towards one side, the other side will surely feel it. And then they would close down in the transactions. And I had to hold these two parties that were at war with one another in equal understanding. And that was when it was highly successful, more than we could ever imagine. And I brought the leaders of the two factions together and I said, why did you agree to come when I came to your country and I asked you to come to the peace table? Why did you agree? And this shocked me more than anything, Heather. They said, because we felt your love and your caring. I was shocked. And because I wasn't judging them, I wasn't trying to change them. And I saw that as a mediator, it was the same process of doing our postures. It was the measure of the success is in not trying to get to a result. And I learned that through the practice of asana, not trying to get my head to my feet in a forward bend, not trying, but allowing the process to carry it and bring it into being. So I did the same with these international peace mediations.
Wow. And that just, I know a lot of the people who listen to this podcast have read my book, The Ayurvedic Guide to Fertility, and a lot of women who want to get pregnant contact me and want to work together. And that's such a huge challenge, I think, and lesson for a lot of women when they, even something like I want to have a baby, or that desire that comes up, and just
Yes.
letting the process unfold. Or
Yeah.
even as we see, by the time this podcast airs, it may be right before or right after the election. But so be curious to see where we're at in the United States at that time. But we know that we do have sides being taken right now by many people. And it's very challenging to step outside of it.
Yeah, it's very difficult times to hold the balance. Very difficult. And I'm not saying I'm successful at it all the time.
And that's why it's a practice.
Yes, you're right. Yeah.
Rama, this has been such a beautiful conversation. I'm so grateful to have this time with you and to give other people the opportunity to hear you speak and tell us a little bit about, how you've done your work and your path and the way that you've been able to make a difference in the world. I mean, Rama even has a Wikipedia page, so you can Google her.
That's right. Somebody put me on that. Someone puts me on everything.
Yeah. But we're so just, for all the listeners and on behalf of the listeners and just so grateful to have you today. I want to thank you for being here.
Oh, Heather, I thank you for doing this podcast and doing the work you're doing in the world. You are that generation that's carrying that light on into the new millennium. Thank you so much for this. Thank you, dear.
Thank you for tuning in and dropping in with us today. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. I really want to hear your feedback. To learn more about my work, visit heathergrish.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. And meet me here next time on The Wisdom of the Body.